Hello, everybody. It's Mr. G, the history teacher, coming at you once again with another Misconceptions in History. Today, we're talking about the tail-sitter aircraft, which is basically an idea to take vertically off from your back and get into the air and take care of business. As soon as the Wright brothers successfully created their powered flight, many people began copying them and improving upon their design. Airplanes would do nothing for the next century but improve. We created better materials for them, better engines, started adding more metal to them, making them heavier. But some of the problems that existed then still exist today, and one of the biggest ones is the bigger you make an airplane, the better the runway needs to be to handle it. Early runways were grass fields, and there was a need to build heavy-duty runways. Gravel and rock became the primary material in the beginning. Eventually, concrete and asphalt would be used. However, this isn't always feasible where you're at. So, as time progressed, people started coming up with alternatives to the traditional aircraft, even right after making it. And so one of the early ones would be an early helicopter. There were more gyrocopters back then, which is basically a airplane-helicopter hybrid. There was even some early quadcopter technology at this time. However, these were still slow and cumbersome and had control issues. There was a need to help airplanes take off faster. Now, one of the first people to come up with this radical new design and idea would be Nikola Tesla. And in 1928, Nikola Tesla patented the design for an airplane that could sit on its tail, take off, fly straight into the air, take care of business, come back down, either land conventionally or back on its tail. Now, the design remained the same. Nothing ever happened. Nothing was built. However, the Second World War happened. By the end of the Second World War, Germany was desperate. Its airfields were being constantly destroyed by Allied bombing, and they needed an alternative aircraft. And they actually came up with 3 of these tail-sitters. Now, one of these prototype aircraft was the Focke-Wulf Triebflugel, which translates to thrust wing hunter. And this is basically the idea of sticking jet engines on the end of a propeller, which was attached to the midsection of an interceptor aircraft. The engines would fire up, spin the blade incredibly fast. This would provide the thrust, fly it up in the air like a helicopter. It would then turn horizontal like a fighter plane, shoot its guns, shoot down whatever bomber was trying to, return to base, and land like a helicopter. That was the idea. They couldn't figure out how to make it work, so they abandoned the project. Now, an even more radical design was the Heinkel Lurch. And this one was basically what looks like a missile, but it's actually not. It's an airplane with what's called a angular wing, a circular wing. And inside that circular wing were 2 contra-rotating propellers. And this would provide the lift, fly it in the air, do almost exactly what the Triebflugel would do. It had its own issues. For one thing, because it was designed by the end of the war, there was no way to build it. The other problem is they couldn't even figure out how to control it properly, so it was abandoned as well. Now, there was one tail-sitting design they actually did build, and that is the Bockum BA-349. And it looks like a missile because it's basically what it is. It's a tail-sitting aircraft that is basically a man-powered missile, and by that I mean a man sat inside the missile. He guided it to its target. There was a few small rockets on the nose cone. It would fire the rockets into its opponent. It would then go back to base, deploy a parachute, and land. They built one of them. The pilot died, and they abandoned the project. And that was the end of development of tail-sitter aircraft until the Cold War started to heat up. And when the Cold War started to heat up in the 50s, there was a need for these aircraft again. NATO powers wanted the ability to deploy these aircraft at a moment's notice from hidden locations that they couldn't easily be seen by the Soviet Union. And so development began again. The United States, France, West Germany, and the USSR all tried to develop tail-sitting aircraft at this time. The 2 biggest competitors in the beginning were Lockheed and Convair, each with their own propeller-powered tail-sitting aircraft. Lockheed had their XFV-1, which held the nickname of the Salmon. It did okay in testing, but they could never get a powerful enough engine for what they needed. The Convair design, known as the XFY Pogo, and this is actually one of my favorites, the Delta Wing design, I think makes it look cool. However, it was ridiculously hard to land, and since this was intended to be used on ships for the Navy, it was abandoned. The final American tail-sitter of the 50s would be the Ryan X-13 Vertijet. Like its propeller-driven cousins, it had its issues. Its thrust-to-weight ratio was pretty much limited by its fuel quantities, and even though it did a great job crossing the Potomac to prove itself to the Pentagon, the Air Force saw no need for it and abandoned the project. Now, the final jet-powered aircraft I want to talk about of the 50s actually comes from France, and it's their C-450 model. And this was an incredibly futuristic-looking design. However, its design was too radical for the time period it was in, and they couldn't even get it to transition from vertical to horizontal flight and back, so the project was completely abandoned. While there were a few more tests that occurred in the 60s and 70s, this was pretty much the end of piloted tail-sitting aircraft. There was a much newer, better development in takeoffs that would come along, and that's all thanks to the British. The British-made Hawker Siddeley Harrier would become the first mass-produced vertically takeoff aircraft. And of course, if you're looking at this going, I know that's the Harrier jet. Yes, but this is the original one. The one that you see here in the United States is the American-produced copy. They beat us to it. I'm sorry, guys. And they were not alone. The Soviet Union produced the Yakovlev Yak-38, their only basically thrust-vectoring vertical takeoff aircraft. And that would continue a further run of production that we see today, in which you have like the F-35 now, which are all use a similar technology. However, that wasn't the end of tail-sitters. Since the late 90s, there has been a resurgence of using tail-sitters as drone aircraft. Now, there is a major advantage to this. You don't need a space like, say, an area a helicopter would need. You could deploy it from a small flat area on a ship, meaning that you have greater advantage on smaller ships for these. In addition, there's the idea of using it as a UCAV, Unmanned Combat Area Vehicle. Northrop Grumman is actually developing what's called the TERN, T-E-R-N, which is the exact purpose of this. But of course, there's always those that still want somebody in the cockpit. NASA actually had a prototype project called the Puffin. It's on the drawing board for well over 10 years. They've never built it. So there you have it, tail-sitter aircraft, a really weird concept that kind of comes and goes. Really don't know if it'll ever pan out, other than maybe the drone idea. But that's all I got for today. Stay tuned for the next time. I am going to discuss the Harrier coming up. I don't know if it'll be next week, but keep a lookout for it.